I've walked through the quiet streets of many forgotten American towns in my time, but none have stayed with me quite like Gales Ferry, Illinois, though you won't find it on any current map. The soil there feels tired, ashen almost, as though something vital was taken from it and never returned. In 1839, Giles Ferry was just beginning to define itself, a modest outpost cradled by winter-stripped sycamores, a town built more on faith than on infrastructure, a post office, a cobbler, a single-room schoolhouse with a stovepipe that never quite stopped coughing soot into the sky, and towering above it all like a shepherd over sheep was St. Matthias of the Bleeding Heart, an imposing stone church brought over brick by brick from a dismantled chapel in Wales. The church became the town's pulse. Its bell dictated life, ringing in births, deaths, weddings, sermons, and sins. But one event, one sound, would sever that pulse. It began, the records say, in November of that year. The earth was hard. The frost had claimed the windows like a jealous lover. Father Adrian Mallory, a newly arrived priest from Baltimore, took his first steps into the chapel with soft boots and a softer disposition. He was young, only 32, but already disillusioned by city politics, sent westward with orders and a hope that perhaps the silence of prairie life might calm his ever-restless spirit. He would not find peace. I found Father Mallory's letters in a Catholic archive in Maryland, still sealed in wax, preserved under the clinical title Incident, St. Matthias, November 1839. But the letters inside are anything but clinical. They read like the unraveling of a man witnessing something just outside the edge of comprehension. In his second letter, he writes, "I was told the church has a root cellar, once used for preserved vegetables during the pioneer winter, but no vegetables remain. Just stone, silence, and a chill that cannot be explained by weather alone." He was not the only one to feel it. Locals at the time spoke in hushed tones. Oral histories passed down through split families and cracked diaries described the same thing. An unease, an unnamed presence in the church. But all accounts converge on one detail, the sound. It came at night, always at night. A sound that began like distant weeping, then changed, rising to the pitch of something not quite human. The floorboards above would groan, but not from footsteps, from something deeper, a pressure perhaps. People said the sound came from the church basement, the very same cellar Father Mallory had once brushed off as irrelevant. He would never dismiss it again. On the night of November 17th, the priest stayed late to prepare a sermon. Snow fell thick against the stained glass, muffling the world outside. He lit candles and settled at the pulpit, drafting his words on mercy. That's when the weeping began. His journal, ink smudged in places by what I can only imagine were trembling hands, records the moment. At first, I believed it was a child. The sobbing had that high, piercing quality, wet and wild, like a heart just broken. But as I descended the nave, the sound changed. It multiplied, then dropped into a register no man could survive. It was like someone screaming into the earth itself. He fled that night. The organ groaned of its own volition. The bell tower shook. He never finished the sermon. By sunrise, Mallory had boarded the basement door shut and nailed a crucifix to it. He told the congregation it was unsafe, claimed the floor was unstable, but several townfolk claimed they saw him later that evening, praying barefoot in the snow, eyes locked on the chapel as though expecting it to speak. It wouldn't be long before the town noticed changes, not in the basement, but in Mallory himself. He stopped delivering mass. He took to sleeping in the belfry, always with a candle burning, and he refused, utterly refused, to ever enter the basement again. That, dear listener, was the beginning of the end for St. Matthias. It would take me years to uncover what was truly beneath that church. The sealed records, the unspoken excommunications, the disappearances dismissed as migration. But in Gales Ferry, people still speak of the sound, those who remain, because something was left in that basement. And in time, we would learn. It was not the only thing left there. Next, we turn to the figures behind the veil of piety, the ones who built their lives above the bones of something terrible. There's an unsettling truth that lies beneath the surface of many small towns. The more pristine the appearance, the more rot you'll find beneath the skin. When I returned to Gales Ferry, what's left of it, I stood in the field where St. Matthias once loomed. There's nothing there now but scorched earth and a stone fragment with a single word still legible, bleeding. The rest is buried or erased. But before that ruin, before the decay, Gales Ferry was something else. It was proud, clean, its people God-fearing, and at the heart of that image stood three pillars: Father Adrian Mallory, the Whittemore family, and Dr. Elijah Callow. Together, they were the spine of Gales Ferry. Let me start with the Whittemores. Abel and Constance Whittemore were among the first settlers, having arrived in 1831 with 2 oxen, a child, and a dream of building a town rooted in moral purpose. Abel was a millwright, strong, with a voice that could command a room, but rarely did. Constance, his wife, was of a different breed. Schoolmom turned Sunday school savant. She taught the scripture with a rigid calm, like a woman who knew that God watched every step she took. They had 5 children, all beautiful, all obedient. Too obedient. Neighbors described them as perfect, not just well-behaved, but rehearsed. A visiting reverend once wrote that watching the Whittemore children move was like watching a troop of angels afraid to blink. They wore matching garments, sang together in eerie harmony, and never once interrupted an adult, not even the youngest. Then there was Dr. Callow, tall, balding, eyes like polished slate, the only formally trained physician for over 40 miles. He delivered every child born in the township over a span of 15 years. Every sickness, every injury, every broken bone passed through his hands. And yet, I found no record, none, of any death certificate he signed. I'm not saying people didn't die in Gales Ferry, they did, but Callow never documented it. Not once. It was as if, on paper, no one ever died there. Together these three, the priest, the family, the doctor, projected a utopian image of Gales Ferry. A holy trinity of moral order, health and faith. But trinity implies balance, and balance, dear listener, was not what they maintained. It was control. One woman, a seamstress named Maribel Quayle, kept a journal I found in a state archive in Springfield. In her entries from 1838, she describes what she called the watchful triad. They come not to ask, but to inspect. I've seen them outside my shop before sunrise, asking about which books I loaned to the children. Dr. Callow asked if I believed in vaccination, and when I said no, he smiled, but did not come back. Nor did Mrs. Kenning, whose infant I was mending clothes for. Maribel left the town 6 weeks later. She would be the first of 17 families to leave Gales Ferry between 1838 and 1841, all without public explanation. In the public eye, however, the image remained pristine. Parish attendance boomed. The Whittemore children led town songs, processions, and winter food drives. And every illness, no matter how small, was brought to Callow's clinic without hesitation. Yet when I tracked the letters of Father Mallory, a different picture began to form. One of unease behind courtesy, of secrets wrapped in scripture. In an undated entry, presumably late 1839, Mallory writes, "Constance visited me with a basket of bread and a caution in her smile. She asked if I'd been praying below, and when I told her I'd sealed the root cellar, she asked if I understood the meaning of the word sealed, not closed, not locked, sealed, as one seals away sin." That word comes up more than once in Mallory's writings. Sealed. He began to suspect that the basement of St. Matthias was never a cellar, and whatever was below, it had always been part of something larger. Another letter hidden between the pages of a baptismal record included only one sentence: "They made me baptize one who had not cried." He never elaborates. But there is another piece of this puzzle. An altar boy, age 11, named Samuel Dorr. The boy was quiet, fatherless, lived with his mother who scrubbed floors in the church in exchange for room and board. In a letter Mallory writes to a friend in Baltimore, he mentions the boy's eyes, that they had become hollow, as if Samuel had seen something he would never speak of again. Shortly after the night of the basement cries, Samuel disappeared. Mallory would only say that the boy had been called away to serve elsewhere, but no assignment record exists, no trace. Yet, in a hidden drawer behind the altar, where Mallory's personal hymnal was kept, I found a page torn from what appears to be a child's journal. It was unsigned, stained in the corner with what looked like candle wax. Scrawled in crude, anxious lettering were 4 words. I saw it blink. That page is now in a sealed evidence envelope in my possession. The deeper I dig, the more I find not answers, but patterns, people vanishing from ledgers, letters scrubbed of dates, and an entire town held under the illusion of divine perfection. But illusions, especially holy ones, only hold if everyone plays their part, and soon someone would stop playing. Time is a fog in towns like Gales Ferry. People forget not because they want to, but because remembering costs too much. But the cracks, as always, began in the smallest places, the kinds of moments we overlook until we realize they were warnings, until hindsight shatters illusion like stained glass on stone. I began piecing together those overlooked warnings through surviving letters, scattered testimonies, and one unlikely source, the ledger of a traveling tinsmith named Ephraim Jutes. Jutes passed through Gales Ferry in late 1839. His journal was a mix of mundane detail and careful observation. On December 2nd, he made a single-line entry that, at the time, meant little to him. Refused basement work at St. Matthias. Told no light could enter. Children were present but did not speak. He never returned to the town. That same day, Father Mallory ceased all public sermons. He still rang the bells, but he would not enter the nave. He began sending letters to the bishopric marked urgent spiritual compromise, but no formal response ever came. Perhaps they thought him troubled, or perhaps they knew too much already. But the townspeople noticed other things, odd, erratic behaviors, not just from the priest, but from the children. The Whittemore children, once seen as the gold standard of virtue, had begun to change. A neighbor named Agnes Dulcimer, a widow who lived near the Whittemore property, left behind a remarkable oral account that was later transcribed in 1911 by her great-niece. In it, she recalled, "They stood out there, those children, just standing, not playing, staring at the church, for hours some days, no coats, no talking. They'd blink so slowly it hurt to watch, like they were listening for something I couldn't hear." More than one child in the town began complaining of identical dreams, of a dark stone room with no windows and a low voice whispering in reverse. One boy, Benjamin Krill, awoke with scratches across his back. His mother, terrified, asked him what happened. He said, "She told me I wasn't clean enough to sing." Another girl, Mary Rathbone, had her hair turned completely white over the course of 3 weeks. When asked by her teacher what she saw, she simply wept and said, "It's still in the wall." But despite these unsettling moments, none of them raised alarms. Not officially. Because when people went to the doctor, Dr. Callow, they were told their children were suffering from night frights. He prescribed tonics, suggested prayer, and closed the case. Callow's medical records, now partially recovered, reveal something more disturbing: repetition. Between November and December of 1839, 12 different children were seen for night terrors, scratches, paralysis, or spontaneous nosebleeds. Each diagnosis was identical: psychogenic seizure syndrome, a term largely abandoned even then. In all 12 cases, the recommended treatment was the same: isolation, strict adherence to catechism, no exposure to music or bells. Music. Bells. Why that mattered, I didn't understand. Not then. And it wasn't just the children. Parishioners began to notice inconsistencies. A family, Jonathan and Ruth Glover, reported hearing the church bell ring at 3:07 a.m. every Wednesday for 3 weeks straight. Yet Father Mallory claimed he had not rung it once. A local baker, Josiah Pell, wrote in a letter to his brother, "The morning snow showed bare feet across the church roof, no prints leading up to it, none leading down, just tracks circling the steeple and stopping at the edge." His letter ends abruptly. Josiah left town 5 days later, without his wife. Then came the incident at the well. 2 children, twins, were found standing inside the town well, not drowned, not injured, just standing. their eyes closed. When pulled out, both were murmuring something in unison. The voice below is rising. No one knew how they got inside. The well cover was iron and locked from the outside. The Whittemores explained it away as spiritual sleepwalking. Constance even held a community prayer circle to ease concerns, and that night she led a hymn with her children by torchlight outside St. Matthias. Every verse emphasized obedience, cleansing, sacrifice. In his final known sermon, never delivered but scribbled in a private journal, Father Mallory wrote, "They think they are purifying, they are preparing. The children are being emptied so that something else may enter. I see it now, and I fear I am already too late." Something had begun to break within him, but what no one noticed, what no one wanted to notice, was that every sign, every oddity, every red flag pointed to one place, the basement. And though Mallory had sealed it shut with prayers and planks, something behind that door had not remained still. In the weeks ahead, an incident would occur, unavoidable, undeniable, that would force the town to finally look down. And once they did, they would never look away again. They say evil doesn't arrive all at once, that it drips, slow and patient, like water hollowing a stone. By the winter of 1839, Gales Ferry had grown quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the suffocating, unnatural silence that presses against your chest. The change wasn't just in the children, it was in the whole town. Families who once held gatherings now shuttered their doors by sundown. Singing in the streets stopped. The baker no longer sold his sweetbread, and the schoolhouse closed without explanation. The only thing that continued, unfazed, was Sunday service, still held at St. Matthias, though attendance was no longer optional. The Whittemores had taken on a new role. Not just congregants, but enforcers of order. Constance Whittemore, in particular, began visiting homes. She called them spiritual check-ins. She would arrive unannounced, carrying a copper-bound copy of the Psalms and a vial of anointing oil said to be from Jerusalem. One woman, Eleanor Birch, who lived alone with her teenage daughter, recorded her visit in a rare surviving personal diary. She asked to see Margaret's tongue, said purity was best measured through the mouth. Then she made her sing a hymn about burning dross from gold. Margaret didn't know the words. Mrs. Whittemore didn't smile again after that. Nice. The next Sunday, Margaret Birch was asked to come to the altar for a special blessing. Witnesses said she cried during it, not from emotion, but from pain. That was the last time anyone saw Margaret in town. They claimed she'd been sent to her cousins in Ohio, but mail sent there was returned unopened. At the same time, more and more children were pulled from school, many under the pretense of private instruction. When I tracked school records, what little survived fire and time, I found gaps. Names removed, attendance erased, but on some pages the faintest trace of ink remained. Entries crossed out with such force the paper tore. A name I saw again and again, before it too was erased, was Elsie Whittemore, the youngest of the Whittemore daughters. 8 years old, exceptionally bright according to her teacher's surviving notes, but also odd. One note read, "Elsie asked what it feels like to die, and if you can still hear singing afterward. I told her no. She smiled and said, 'Not always.'" Elsie stopped attending school 2 weeks before the crying began. The next clue came from the church's sacristan, a man named Reuben Clagg. He'd kept the books, tended the candles, polished the brass. He wasn't educated, but he was observant. One night he left town, just vanished, but not before he left behind a sealed note for the travelling magistrate, a Mr. Arnold Greaves. The letter, preserved in Greaves' private estate and now in my possession, contained a single line. "I heard them singing below, and they were not singing to God." What he meant, what he truly meant, would only become clear when I obtained an audio simulation created from surviving architectural notes of the chapel's acoustics. Based on the construction of St. Matthias, the basement acted like a chamber, channeling upward any sound below it. But only at certain frequencies, and only when the nave was empty. In short, the weeping people had heard. It wasn't imagined. It was real. It had always been real. And then, like a crack forming in stone, the tension gave way to collapse. It began with a blizzard. February 1840. The worst the region had seen in a decade. Winds howled like beasts across the open plains. Snow buried windows. Travel was impossible, which meant for the first time in months, no Sunday service could be held. That night, the basement door burst open. Witnesses reported a noise like splintering bone and iron being torn apart. The basement, which Father Mallory had sealed with holy water and nails, was suddenly open again. But what truly shook the town wasn't the breach. It was who went inside, Constance Whittemore. She arrived at the church barefoot, wearing only a white shift. Her hair was unbound, trailing in the wind, lips moving in soundless prayer. Behind her marched 4 of her children, silent, eyes fixed forward like candles before a wake. She opened the basement door, and she went down. Father Mallory arrived 20 minutes later, dragged by 2 men who had found him sobbing in the rectory, clutching a Bible to his chest and muttering Latin prayers in reverse. He fought against them when they tried to take him to the basement. He screamed, "She's taking them down to listen. Don't you understand? She wants them to hear it speak." What happened next is unconfirmed. Most of the town was either locked inside their homes or too afraid to come out. But from those who did, they all agree on this. Around midnight, the bell rang 13 times, then stopped, and the sound that followed was not human. One man described it as a whale dying under stone. Another woman said it sounded like her own mother's voice, calling from under the floorboards. A child said it was music played backward, but with teeth. When the blizzard cleared the next morning, the church stood silent. Father Mallory, they say, was found kneeling at the altar, lips bloodied, eyes wide open. The children were gone. So was Constance. The basement door had been sealed again, but this time with salt and blood and rope. From that day forward, Mallory would not enter the chapel again, not to pray, not to confess, not even to die. Something had changed in him. Something had been let out, or perhaps something had been invited in, and still no one in authority took action. But one person did, a physician's apprentice, dismissed as a simpleton, overlooked, ignored. But he had been keeping records, watching, listening, and soon he would begin to investigate, even if it cost him his sanity. There is a sound I still hear in dreams. It's not the cries, not the whispers. It's silence, impossibly deep, pulsing silence that tells you something is waiting beneath it, something old, something hungry. February 1840, Gales Ferry. The night the storm broke and the basement door splintered open, something else began to unravel. Trust. The facade cracked. People started whispering openly about the Whittemores, about the priest, about the missing children. And though they whispered, they still didn't act. Fear had rooted itself deeper than faith, but not in everyone. The man who would become the first true witness of what lay beneath St. Matthias was not a hero. He was considered dull, a background character in most records. His name was Jared Ansell, age 23, a medical apprentice under Dr. Elijah Callow, until he wasn't. Jared had been dismissed weeks prior for spiritual contamination, according to a note signed by Callow and co-signed, curiously, by Constance Whittemore herself. The reason? Jared had questioned a treatment plan involving bloodletting and isolation for a child who heard singing from inside their own lungs. After his dismissal, Jared left the clinic, but not the town. Instead, he began documenting everything he could. Attendance logs, missing children, townspeople leaving without farewell, the repetition of phrases like "the voice below," and especially the sermons, those few that still happened, where scripture began to change. Jared's notes survived because he buried them, literally. They were found in 1987 during a plumbing excavation beneath what is now a collapsed farmstead near Gales Ferry's original boundary. Bundled in oilskin, his papers remain dry, preserved, chillingly detailed. From his writings, children disappear. They say it's illness, but illness does not wear new shoes, nor leave behind only teeth. Something happens below, I believe the priest knows. He has sealed the basement again. But the salt is different now. It's blackened. He continues. There was a girl, Esther Plum. I treated her for a fever 3 weeks ago. Constance came during the exam and asked Esther if she had confessed. The girl said yes. Constance smiled. The next day the girl was gone. Her house was abandoned, even the curtains gone. But the entry that marked the true turning point, the triggering incident, was dated March 4th, 1840. It reads, "Today, a boy was found behind the church. His feet were burned, skin around the mouth blistered in a perfect circle. He had been made mute, lips sewn shut. He could not speak, but he drew something in the mud, a spiral made of eyes." Jared tried to intervene. He attempted to bring the boy, no name listed, to the local judge, Mr. Arnold Greaves. But Greaves was not home, or so he was told. Jared returned the next morning to find the boy gone, a clean patch of earth where he had drawn. The next event is one of the only officially recorded documents in the Gales Ferry town ledger, though it's framed under the title Incident Structural Collapse at St. Matthias. But Jared's notes contradict that explanation. According to him, this was no accident. The church floor had caved in during a Thursday Mass. Only half the congregation was inside. A gaping hole, 5 feet across, had opened at the base of the altar. No bodies fell in, but they say something came out. Jared wrote, "The priest screamed. I had never heard a man make that sound. He did not scream words. He screamed memory, like something was being pulled from him, something that should have stayed buried." Witnesses said the church bell rang once more during the collapse, but no one had pulled the rope. The bell tower itself had already collapsed. 2 parishioners fainted. One man, a blacksmith named Eli Dunn, clawed at his ears until blood ran down his neck. When asked later what he heard, he said, "My mother, but she died in Boston, and she told me to join her under the floor." The priest vanished that same night, gone, his quarters undisturbed, the back door of the rectory wide open. No footprints in the snow, only a rosary, half melted, hanging from a doorknob. After that, attendance at church ceased entirely. Families barricaded their homes. A wagon was seen leaving town under the cover of dusk. Locals believed it carried Dr. Callow and the remaining Whittemore children, but no one stopped it. No one followed. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sounds stopped. No more cries, no more weeping, no more dreams, just silence again. For a while, the town pretended life had resumed, but in Jared's final pages he writes, "They are not gone, they are waiting. The house of stone is now empty, but the pit remains, and it is not a basement, it is a throat, and the town was its voice." He tried to warn the governor, sent letters, no response. Eventually, he left too. The last entry reads, "I must go where no prayers have been offered, where no bells have ever rung. That is the only place it cannot find me." Jared Ansell was never seen again, but 2 months after his disappearance, children in a town 60 miles east began waking up with the same spiral drawn into the dirt beneath their beds, the same spiral made of eyes. It's a terrible thing to witness evil and be asked to forget it. By the spring of 1840, something had undeniably ruptured in Gales Ferry. The cries from beneath St. Matthias had stopped. Yes, but in their place was an atmosphere even more suffocating, as if whatever had made those cries had finally come to rest, or worse, had been fed. But fear doesn't dissolve overnight. It seeps into bones, into families, into records, and in this case, it seeped into the silence of bureaucracy. You see, after the incident at St. Matthias, the so-called floor collapse, there was briefly an attempt at official inquiry. A formal letter of concern was sent by a local schoolteacher to the Illinois Department of Civic Safety. In it, she wrote, "I fear there has been a rot beneath our chapel, not metaphorical, literal, something that lives where light won't go. I have watched children forget how to blink, watched a woman's hair turn white overnight, and watched the priest, once full of fire, pray as if he were bargaining with the dirt itself." Her letter was received, stamped, filed, then buried. The state's reply came nearly a month later, and it was a single sentence. Local infrastructure collapse noted. Recommend engineering reinforcement and spiritual counseling. It was signed by a clerk who would, coincidentally, go missing the following winter during a train stop near Quincy. No foul play was determined. But his wife would later tell a reporter that, in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he had stopped speaking entirely, only humming, a single, descending scale. In Gales Ferry, the town did what small towns always do. It tried to survive through erasure. St. Matthias was boarded up, no longer used. A motion was passed to restructure the spiritual center of the community. Translation, pretend it never happened. But not everyone could forget, not the doctor who tried to speak. Her name was Dr. Miriam Hemsley, a young physician from St. Louis, who had arrived in Gales Ferry with her husband just weeks before the basement incident. Her practice was modest, her reputation unremarkable, until she treated the son of Eli Dunn, the blacksmith who clawed his own ears after hearing the voice during the church collapse. Young Thomas Dunn, age 6, had developed sudden aphasia. He no longer responded to speech, avoided mirrors, and scratched spirals into every wooden surface he could reach. Dr. Hemsley's medical notes read more like dream fragments than diagnoses. Pupil dilation during exposure to church hymns, inverted REM patterns, skin temperature drops when near sanctified spaces, responds to negative space, will stare for hours at empty corners, and when asked about the church, he whispers one word, "Mother." She reported her findings to the town magistrate. Nothing was done. Then she reported them to the Illinois State Board of Medicine. No reply. When she approached the bishopric with questions about Father Mallory, they sent a letter back stating only, "Father Mallory's behavior falls under internal ecclesiastical concern. Please direct all inquiries to the Office of Clerical Health." The letter was unsigned. Hemsley didn't stop. She began compiling her own file, a thick stack of patient charts, journal entries, and interviews with families. One entry was a direct quote from a former choir singer, a girl named Sarah Timms, age 12. "They took us below before the bells. We had to take our shoes off. It was cold. She said we had to make our voices thin enough to fit through the cracks. She said the stone wanted a lullaby." Sarah vanished 2 nights later. Dr. Hemsley tried to raise the alarm through the press. She sent her file to the Quincy Intelligencer. The paper never ran her piece. But her husband told colleagues she received a letter from the editor 3 weeks later that simply read, "Your findings are interesting, but this town has no basement." She stopped practicing medicine that same year, moved, changed her name. Her husband would later write that Miriam no longer trusted sound. She wrote notes instead of speaking, refused to enter buildings with stone foundations. And once, when he tried to surprise her with a gift, a metronome for her piano, she shattered it with a hammer before he could even explain. Her notes would only surface a century later in a university archive, mislabeled as case studies, psychological harm in isolated clerical communities. But even as investigators like Hemsley sounded alarms, the authorities of the time resisted violently. Which brings us to Deputy Elias Brand, a man who had been stationed in Gales Ferry for over 15 years. Brand was considered a practical man, no nonsense, until the day he was ordered to inspect the church. His report, one of the last official documents preserved from that era, contains several chilling passages, but one in particular. There is a smell below, not rot, not mold, something colder, older. The air feels like it has teeth. I did not descend far. Something whispered. I thought it was my own name, but it spoke it in reverse. Elias submitted his report, then promptly resigned. He left town without warning. His home was found abandoned, fireplace still lit, a single phrase etched into the wall above his cot. Do not speak where echoes live. Whatever happened in that basement, whatever truth tried to rise, was swallowed by layers of institutional resistance. The clergy deflected, the state deflected. Even local law enforcement began urging people not to poke at darkness that has settled. The case, as far as officials were concerned, was closed, but of course it wasn't, because beneath the silence, something continued to stir. And one man, an outsider with no allegiance to the town, would begin to investigate, piece by piece, file by file. And in doing so, he would expose the pattern, the lies, the blood, and ultimately, the horror. Every story like this needs someone who refuses to let it die. Not a hero, not a savior, just someone too obsessed, too curious, or too broken to look away. For the horror buried beneath St. Matthias and the long shadow cast over Gales Ferry, that man was Charles Pelham. He wasn't born in Gales Ferry. He wasn't even born in Illinois. Pelham was a historical archivist with the Illinois Department of Land Records, assigned in 1891 to document ghost towns from the state's early settlement years. Most of his work involved land deeds, agricultural maps, and early rail layouts, until he found a name on a document that didn't make sense: Gales Ferry Township, abandoned, 1843. Cause: subsidence, earth collapse. But there were no quarry records, no fault lines, no mining, just a town that folded in on itself like it had been scooped out. Pelham became curious. He requested the full case archive. There was none. That's when he started digging. Not with a shovel, but with requests, letters, church archives, university logs. What he found over the next 3 years became what he referred to in his private notebooks as the pattern. Here's how it started. First, he found a partial census log from 1837. Gales Ferry reported a population of 312. Then, a post-flood recovery census in 1841, just 4 years later, showed 119 residents. By 1844, 11, then nothing. Pelham followed the names, mothers, children, young couples, and discovered something chilling. Entire families had been relocated to towns that had no record of ever receiving them. He called it the vanishing spiral, a term he underlined over and over in his margins, because when he drew their movements on a map, the migration formed a perfect curve outward from Gales Ferry, as if they had been ejected from the center of a whirlpool. But what made it more disturbing was that the spiral didn't end. It continued, names reappearing under aliases in towns as far east as Pennsylvania and as far south as Georgia. Same family structures, same silence, same disappearances. He suspected at first it was religious exile, a cult on the run, but the deeper he went, the more he found the same elements repeating: towns with a church built on stone, a priest who withdrew, children who stopped speaking, and a basement, always sealed. Pelham's breakthrough came when he found a church bell. It had been relocated to a chapel in southern Indiana, sold by a broker who claimed it had survived a fire in an abandoned settlement near the Spoon River. Pelham traced it to St. Matthias, confirmed by the Latin engraving inside the bronze lip: Domine libera me sub terra, Lord, deliver me beneath the earth. No such phrase appeared in any canonical liturgy. Pelham knew what he was looking for now. He turned next to private letters. He discovered correspondence from a woman named Miriam Hemsley, the doctor we discussed in Part 6. Her last surviving letter, dated 1862 and addressed to an anonymous bishop, contained fragments that Pelham would later highlight in red ink. They do not fear hell. They believe they have already entered it, and that their suffering is the price of keeping it fed. He sang through the gaps in the floorboards. My husband said it was a hymn. I say it was a birth. But the true spark came when Pelham obtained a private journal from a retired Unitarian minister who claimed on his deathbed that he once sat with Father Adrian Mallory in a sanitarium in Missouri. In that journal, one passage stands out: he would not speak for days. Then suddenly he asked me if I believed in saints that had never lived. I asked him what he meant. He said, they made one, below the altar. They made a saint out of mouths, and they prayed to it. This journal gave Pelham his final push. He returned to the ruins of Gales Ferry himself. What remained was skeletal, brick outlines, frost-stiffened fields, the church foundation like a tombstone for something unmarked. But beneath the cracked stones of St. Matthias, Pelham found an entrance, sealed with pitch, burnt cloth, rope that had turned brittle in the wind. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He listened. In a letter never sent but found folded in his effects after his death, Pelham wrote, "It was still breathing. Whatever it is, whatever they fed, it does not need to eat often, but it needs to hear. They sang to it, with children, with lies, with grief. It lives in the pitch between notes." He tried to publish his findings. No paper would print them. Even the most liberal editors accused him of hoaxing, of hysteria, of madness. One letter warned him plainly, "Mr. Pelham, your findings suggest ritual child harm. If such evidence existed, it would have come to light long ago. Please refrain from contacting us again." So Pelham stopped. But not before he sent copies of his notes, marked "Pattern, Faith-Rooted Obscurity and Acoustic Worship," to the Illinois Historical Preservation Society. They were catalogued as folklore, dismissed. But those of us who know better, those who have read the field notes, who have felt the curve of that spiral, know what Pelham was trying to do. He wasn't just looking for Gales Ferry. He was mapping a network of belief, of control, of rot, disguised as salvation. And soon what he found would be given a name, a theology, a system, some patterns formed by chance, coincidence, random alignment, but others are carved, cut deep into paper, soil and skin, repeating not because of accident, but design. By the end of his research, Charles Pelham understood one thing clearly. What happened in Gales Ferry wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a system, a deliberate method disguised as worship, a ritual practice hidden in the folds of liturgy, routine, and generational silence. A theology that used Scripture not as salvation, but as scaffolding for control. This wasn't just faith gone wrong. It was faith repurposed into something hollow, something exacting. And for the first time, Pelham had enough to trace the pieces back to their origin. Let's step into what he uncovered. It began, as many horrors do, with paperwork. Pelham found a cache of documents in the Diocese of Peoria, sealed in a folio labeled simply "Unrecognized Practices, F.R.A. Mallory." Inside were parish ledgers from St. Matthias. Most pages were mundane, donation lists, hymn schedules, catechism rosters. But in the margins, written in a faint, slanted hand, were marks, coded notations, dates circled, names with tiny symbols beside them. Some had spirals, others had slashes. Pelham cross-referenced the names marked with spirals and discovered something chilling. Every one of them belonged to a child who later disappeared from school records, church rolls, or family trees. The spiral wasn't decoration, it was designation, chosen. These children weren't victims of random evil. They had been selected. But for what? The answer came from a set of letters written by a nun named Sister Imelda Ferrix, who served at a convent near the Spoon River from 1832 to 1839. She left the order under mysterious circumstances, but not before she wrote a final confession to a friend in Boston. They call it the lamentation rite. It is not sanctioned, it is old, older than Rome, older than the hymns. They do it in stone churches, always stone. The children must be small, their lungs pure. They must not speak a lie after midnight, or the voice will reject them. They fasten their ears with oil. They sing a scale that doesn't exist. The song must end with weeping, not performed, real. They say it nourishes something below, something kept beneath the house of God, the lamentation rite. A ritual meant to prepare the foundation of a church for divine resonance, except, according to Ferrix, it was never about divinity. It was about resonance, frequency, alignment, creating a living echo chamber between the congregation and something beneath. Not hell, not heaven, something else. Ferrix described a crude cosmology sketched by an unnamed priest who had been excommunicated in 1803. He said the flesh below is listening, that the world was built on its back, and if we sing the right way, pure, cold, and in harmony, it hears us, and it gives us peace at a price. Her final letter simply read, "They say God hears prayers, but not all things that listen are God." Pelham took these pieces and laid them atop the spiral path he had already traced. The migration of families, the reappearance of the same patterns, a church, a priest, a collapse, and children vanishing without official inquiry. What emerged was horrifyingly consistent. In towns across Illinois, Indiana, and even parts of southern Wisconsin, similar entries appeared in local histories. 1846, New Haven, church closed after structural damage. 5 children lost to river accident, no river nearby. 1851, Still Point, a sickness spread in spring. All surviving adults reported hearing hymns from drains. 1858, Pine Water, town disbanded after a mine collapse. No mine ever recorded, all parish records missing. Each time, a church, a basement, a sudden disappearance or auditory phenomena. Each time, the authorities looked away, and always, a spiral, found on pages, etched into floorboards, scratched onto the inside of cellar doors. In one recovered hymnal, believed to have belonged to a member of the Whittemore family, Pelham found a series of musical notations next to a passage from Psalm 69. I am come into deep waters, where the floods overflow me. But the musical scale beside it was incomplete. It ended on a descending fifth, a note that leaves the chord unresolved. Pelham had the composition played in a controlled acoustics lab at the University of Chicago. The result? A low vibration began to build in the room, so low it could not be consciously heard, only felt. The technician operating the equipment said he experienced a sudden sense of falling. Another heard a voice, his mother's, though she had died a decade earlier. He quit the next day. The scale had no name. But Pelham dubbed it the inversion chord, the exact sequence sung by the children of St. Matthias during the rite. According to Ferrix's letter, the children were not sacrificed. Not exactly. They were emptied, made into vessels. Their silence became a mirror. Their suffering became a tuning fork, a way to open a resonance below. Pelham's final conclusion. The lamentation rite was not about calling forth a being. It was about tuning the foundation of a sacred space into an instrument, to allow something beneath the world to listen back, to hear us. And what listens long enough eventually answers. But Pelham wouldn't live to finish his report. He was found in his home in 1894, surrounded by candles, every reflective surface shattered, pages torn from his notes and burned in the fireplace. His last words, according to the coroner's report, tell them not to sing, not even to themselves. The pieces were there now. The pattern was clear, but it would take one final act, violent, impossible to ignore, for the world to finally confront what lay beneath St. Matthias. And when they did, it would be far too late. There are truths so old, they become indistinguishable from belief. Rituals so meticulously repeated that they lose their origins, becoming pure action, empty of meaning but potent with consequence. That's what Pelham uncovered. A system, a rite. But what he couldn't fully grasp, what no one could until the records emerged, was the why. Why had they done it? What made an entire town, an entire congregation, willfully participate in something so cruel, so methodical? What belief kept them anchored through cries, disappearances, and blood? To answer that, we must go deeper, into the minds of the faithful, and into the writings of those who orchestrated it. Because the lamentation rite wasn't just a ritual, it was a theology, a cosmology. A document unearthed in 1933, hidden inside a hollowed-out beam during the demolition of an abandoned Lutheran church in Ashcombe, changed everything. Bound in linen, it bore no title, but historians now refer to it as the Book of Reversal. Its pages are filled with contradictions of familiar scripture. Blessed are the emptied, for they shall bear no burden. The first shall silence the last. In the beginning was the mouth, and the mouth was without form. And the mouth opened, and lo, it consumed sound. These weren't parables, they were instructions. The book is structured around 3 primary beliefs, each more disturbing than the last. The flesh is an obstruction. They believed the human body was not a vessel of divinity, but of interference. It blocked the true resonance of the voice below. Pain, particularly the pain of children, thinned the interference. Tears were sacred because they pierced the distortion. The more a child wept in purity, the clearer the transmission became. 2. God is too loud. Their writings claimed that the God of the modern world, of cathedrals and thunder, was a false amplification, a distortion of the older sound beneath creation. The voice below was subtler. It existed in echo, silence, and grief. It didn't demand worship. It required cleansing, cleansing of sound, cleansing of memory, cleansing of self. Hence the acts we now understand. The fasting, the muteness, the spirals, the emotional numbing. These were not punishments. They were preparations. 3. The spiral is the true path. The spiral, etched into pews, drawn in children's blood, carved into stones, was not symbolic. It was acoustic, a guide for sound, a channel through which the voice below could rise. The priests believed the spiral must be reinforced with ritual, renewed by generation, and fed by selected children who became conduits. These were not martyrs, they were chambers. One passage reads, "The vessel must be small. It must not speak its own name. It must dream in stillness. It must sing a note never taught aloud." The notes themselves were passed down through breath, not written, sung into ears, whispered just once, repeated until they became memory, not melody. Another line, "He who listens too long will weep without reason. He who sings the last note will be remembered in reverse." Then there is the doctrine of the mouth, perhaps the most chilling element of the entire theology. This was the center of it all, the mouth beneath. Not metaphor, not allegory. They believed that beneath the church, in Gales Ferry and in other towns like it, existed a literal mouth. Not flesh and teeth, but a metaphysical aperture. A listening wound in the fabric of the world. A place where forgotten sound pooled, where grief took form. Their goal wasn't to awaken it. It was to keep it satisfied. One entry from Father Adrian Mallory, hidden inside the spine of an altered hymnal, reveals the extent of his belief. We do not serve God, we serve the cavity. It is absence, it is listening, it is what remains after joy is scraped clean. Every child's cry nourishes it, every silence deepens it. I sealed the basement because I finally understood. It is not our salvation, it is our mirror, it reflects our hollowing. And then, the mouth does not speak, it remembers. This is what drove Father Mallory to madness. This is what broke the children. This is what kept the Whittemores kneeling in the snow, whispering lullabies with cracked lips. And all of it, every chant, every prayer, every spiral, was meant to keep the mouth listening just enough, but not hungering. The doctrine warned, if the rites failed, if the song ended, if the silence was interrupted, it would open. That was the real terror. They weren't praying to keep it alive. They were praying to keep it asleep. And when the cries stopped in the winter of 1840, when Father Mallory sealed the door for the final time and disappeared into the fields, it wasn't because the ritual had succeeded. It was because it had failed. And what came next would force the town, the state, and eventually the nation to confront what lay hidden beneath the floorboards of St. Matthias, because it would no longer remain quiet. The house of God is not supposed to bleed, but on the morning of June 11th, 1840, it did. The final days of St. Matthias began not with screams or sirens, but with a sound no one could explain. One that dozens of witnesses described as a deep inhalation, like a lung the size of the town itself, pulling in its first breath. And then came the blood, dark, thick, and cold, pooling from the foundation of the sealed church, running in rivulets along the edges of the stone floor. No source, no bodies, no explanation. The sheriff at the time, a man named Thomas Grinnell, wrote only one sentence in his incident log: "The church is bleeding. We are not equipped for this." But it wasn't until the children returned that the town finally snapped. 3 of them, long presumed dead, were seen standing barefoot outside the church's rear wall, facing inward, arms slack. One of them was Elsie Whittemore. She hadn't aged. Her hair was still braided the way it had been the winter she vanished. Witnesses say she was singing, but the sound made no sense. Her mouth moved slowly, like underwater. Some said they heard nothing. Others claimed it was their own name, sung like a lullaby. Then, with perfect synchronization, the children stopped. They turned toward the forest and walked into it without a word. They were never seen again. That afternoon, it was finally decided. The church would be opened, not for mass, for answers. A constable from a nearby township, Ezekiel Crow, volunteered to lead a search party. He brought 7 men, axes, lanterns, a blacksmith's tools to break open the basement. They arrived before dusk. Witnesses remember the sound of wood splitting, of iron tools clattering against stone. The men went in. Only one came back out. His name was Henry Blas, a carpenter, 34, formerly of New Avon. He emerged at sunrise, barefoot, shirtless, soaked in what smelled like salt water. His eyes were dilated, his fingernails torn. He said only one thing before he collapsed. "It's not a basement, it's a throat." He died before he could be questioned. A second party was assembled. This time, state officials were involved. Governor Thomas Carlin sent military support under the pretense of quarantine and structural emergency. 20 men, ropes, firearms. What they found beneath St. Matthias would never be made public, at least not through official channels. The state records for the operation were sealed, burned, later lost. But one soldier, Private Michael Harrow, a distant ancestor of mine, whose war diaries I uncovered buried in a barn in southern Iowa, recorded what he saw in a note smuggled to his wife. There were doors beneath doors, not wood, not brick, something else, like flesh turned to stone. It pulsed when we got close. There were holes in the walls, mouths maybe, I don't know. They weren't breathing, they were listening. We threw holy water on one, it hissed. We found bones, not buried, arranged. Stacked, teeth placed in circles, shoes filled with salt, symbols I don't want to describe. The air was wet with music, but we couldn't hear it. We felt it, like we were being played. Then he added, "We burned it. We had to. It screamed once. I've never felt that kind of sound. It came from inside me." St. Matthias burned for 3 days. Flames reached 50 feet into the sky. They say the fire didn't crackle, it sang, a single unbroken note that held until the bell tower fell. Witnesses miles away reported nosebleeds, vomiting, spontaneous seizures. Livestock miscarried. A nearby river turned black for 12 hours. When it was done, nothing remained of the church but stone, charred, cracked. The ground beneath it sagged. And then the state declared it condemned. They called it a gas explosion, cited improper masonry, no mention of the spiral, no mention of the children. But the people remembered. What was buried beneath? The mouths in the walls, the bleeding floor, the doors made of bone, could not be scrubbed from memory. Some fled, some went mad, others stayed, but no one sang again. A single wooden cross was placed at the edge of the former church site. No name, no dedication, just the words, "Let silence remain." But silence, as we've come to learn, is never neutral. It absorbs. It waits. And years later, when new houses were built over the land, people began to report strange phenomena. Babies who cried in reverse, pipes that groaned like voices, entire families who abandoned their homes without collecting belongings. The spiral, it seems, is never fully closed. What the state called a containment, others call a failure. Because the mouth, once fed, is never truly satisfied. The fire ended the church, but it didn't end the story. After the flames died down, there was no trial, no formal investigation, no headlines in regional papers, just silence, both governmental and spiritual. St. Matthias was left off all future maps. The official line was, "Church collapsed during a fire, cause unknown." But survivors don't forget, and the survivors, if that word can even apply, carried wounds deeper than ash. We begin with Sarah Dunn, the older sister of the boy, who'd scratched spirals into the walls and whispered about the voice in his lungs. She was 14 when she testified, unofficially, to a local pastor who recorded their conversation in a worn field notebook. I found it inside a box labeled Unclaimed Oral Histories, 1800s. He wouldn't eat anymore, Sarah said. My brother. He said it made his voice too loud. He said it hurt her. Who? The pastor asked. The mother in the stone. Sarah's brother was never seen again. He wasn't in the basement, wasn't found in the remains. Sarah lived out her life in a sanatorium in Galena. Her records list her as non-verbal by the age of 20. Her only known drawing, done in pencil on the back of a visitor pass, is a spiral. Inside it, dozens of tiny faces with mouths sewn shut. Then there was Henry Blas, the carpenter who had emerged from the basement soaked in salt water. He died within hours, but not before coughing up a mouthful of blood and saying, I saw my mother, but her eyes were on the inside. His body was autopsied by a physician unaffiliated with the town. Notes from that examination survive. Lungs filled with saline. Tongue appeared artificially shortened. Inside his stomach, a child's milk tooth wrapped in linen. No explanation was given. We know that Dr. Elijah Callow vanished shortly before the fire. Pelham's notes later linked him to a traveling revivalist group known as the Order of Echo Saints, who preached that divine truth could only be accessed through soundless faith. The group dissolved after several members were accused of ritual starvation in children. Callow's death was never recorded. But in 1883, a corpse was found buried in a chapel in Osage, Iowa, headless, with a spiral etched into the ribcage. Locals believed it to be his. And what of the Whittemore family? Only Elsie, the youngest, was seen again. On that day, she and the other missing children returned briefly before walking silently into the forest. Her fate remains unknown. No records of her appear after that day. But decades later, in 1906, a small town in Kentucky reported a teacher who matched Elsie's exact description, unnervingly young for her role, yet claiming to be born in 1831. She taught music to orphaned girls. When the school caught fire, 4 girls died. The only body not recovered? Hers. As for Father Adrian Mallory, the man who sealed the basement and then vanished, his body was never found, but in 1869 a man was found wandering a quarry near Galena, barefoot, muttering prayers in broken Latin. He refused food, repeated a single phrase, I can still hear them humming. He died of exposure. The coroner's sketch bears a striking resemblance to Mallory's last known portrait. There were attempts at justice, of course. A few locals petitioned for exhumations, for criminal inquiry, for someone to be held responsible. But with the fire having consumed most of the evidence, and the remaining survivors scattered, traumatized, or dead, no case was ever brought forward. The state issued a final memo in 1842 stating, the matter of St. Matthias has been internally resolved. All theological misconduct has been addressed. Further inquiry is unnecessary. But others wouldn't let it go. Charles Pelham, before his death, compiled a list of 42 names he believed were either involved in or survivors of the lamentation rite. When he attempted to contact them in his final years, only 3 responded. One, a woman who signed her letter simply LR, wrote, I still can't listen to music, Mr. Pelham. Not even a child's hum. I keep thinking I'll hear the wrong note, and it will come back. Another response was less restrained. It came scrawled on the back of a missing persons flyer from 1892. We are not survivors. We are echo. We are what remains after the voice has passed through. Of the 42 names, 16 were later found dead in remote areas. 3 were committed to asylums. 7 simply disappeared. But what we do have are their stories, bits of them, scraps, and each one is marked by the same recurring theme, a moment of forgetting. A sound that doesn't belong, a sensation of being watched from below. These are not coincidences, they are reverberations. Some trauma echoes louder than screams, some rituals leave stains too deep to bleach. And in the case of Gales Ferry, what was buried beneath the chapel floor didn't just haunt the people who lived through it. It rewrote them, silenced them, and in some cases used them, because the mouth doesn't just feed, it remembers. And those who were made to sing into its depths remain, part of its song. Gales Ferry is not on modern maps. There are no highway signs pointing to it, no postal code, no historical marker. The town was officially dissolved in 1843, its lands sold off to private owners, much of it swallowed by forest and field. But if you go there, if you walk the cracked stone path through the overgrown sycamores, you'll find it. What remains? Just a circle of blackened earth, half-buried fragments of stone walls, and a single wooden post, leaning at an angle, still etched with those faded, chilling words, "Let silence remain." For decades, no one spoke of the lamentation rite. Survivors kept their heads low, whistleblowers were ignored, discredited, or lost to time, and yet the memory survived. Not in museums or textbooks, but in behavior, in the quiet instincts of those who once lived beneath the mouth. I found a woman, Mina Hemsley, great-granddaughter of Dr. Miriam Hemsley. She now lives in Wisconsin, a school teacher, polite, reserved. She keeps all her clocks set 6 minutes apart, and her mirrors always covered at night. When I asked her what she knew of Gales Ferry, her hands trembled. "My grandmother told me stories," she said. "Not bedtime stories, warnings about how music can open things, about how you never ever sing in stone rooms. Not even to yourself." I asked if she believed any of it. She said only, "It doesn't matter if I believe. It remembers either way." She showed me a box she keeps in her attic. Inside, her grandmother's Bible, its cover worn thin, and tucked inside the last page, a small spiral drawn in ash, and beneath it, in faint pencil, "Do not teach this note." It's the same warning found in Charles Pelham's final notebook. The same one marked into the ribcage of the headless corpse in Osage. The same note that once bled through the walls of St. Matthias. There is no church there now, but every few years someone reports hearing a sound in the fields, a tone, low, sustained. It comes from nowhere and disappears when approached. In 1984, a group of spiritual revivalists built a tent tabernacle on the old site. They burned it down themselves 6 days later. One of them later told a reporter, "We didn't feel God, we felt something else listening." And in 2007, a family purchased land adjacent to the old church plot. Their daughter, age 9, began drawing spirals, stopped speaking. When asked what the drawings were, she said, "It's the shape of how it breathes." They moved away within the year. There have been no formal ceremonies for those who vanished in Gales Ferry, no memorials, no gravestones. Most of the children were never officially declared dead. The state never reopened the case. The diocese refuses to acknowledge that St. Matthias ever existed, though its bell sits in a Catholic archive in St. Louis, unlabeled, with a warning not to ring. But for those of us who remember, for those who carry the echo, we find our own ways to grieve. There is now a small memorial stone at the edge of what was once the chapel. It was placed by a volunteer anonymously, etched simply with, "For the voices that were never meant to carry weight." I stood there not long ago, alone. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment it sounded like distant weeping. But no, it was only my imagination. That's what I told myself. That's what we all tell ourselves, because some truths are too heavy to hold, too terrifying to name, and too dangerous to listen for. The mouth still waits beneath the silence, and sometimes, when the world gets too loud, it stirs. So we sing soft lullabies to ourselves. We say the children just wandered off, that the stone just cracked from age, that the screams in the walls were only wind. We say it all because we need to believe that the past is buried, but it isn't. It listens, and sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most. You've been listening to The Macabre Record, narrated by Daniel Harrow. This was episode 23, The Macabre Cries heard from the church basement and the priest who refused to enter again. Stay silent, stay safe, and never sing in stone.